Let's start with chapter 3, that is coloniality, indigenous faiths, nature, and knowledge. Now, the fact of the matter is that when we talk about colonialism, we talk about the destruction of the independence of the indigenous people, their economic resources, the exploitation of the people, but we never talk about the loss of the original indigenous perspective that was there with these people. We take these things for granted. Itself shows that we are measuring colonialism on the anvils of development of the European colonizers, because they prioritize this sort of a development rather than focusing on the original indigenous perspective that was of these peoples. Hence, the essence of this particular book or this chapter is understanding these particular things to restore agency to the indigenous perspective, which is to say that this indigenous perspective will help these people in understanding what exactly they have lost. Because unless and until they understand what they have lost of their indigenous perspective and they are unconscious to this reality, they will simply continue to measure their losses on the developmental indicators as set to them by the European colonizers rather than reclaiming their own agency of it. Which brings us to one of the most fundamental losses that happened of the indigenous perspective and the indigenous people, which is about the relationship between human and nature. Now, after the age of discovery and the Enlightenment movement, humanism became the central feature of the colonial empire, which is to say that humans are above nature and humans have the moral right and the tendency to exploit nature. And this was in complete contrast to the perspective of the native people. For instance, the Native Americans believed the earth to be like a womb or womb of a mother from which people came out, and hence the earth was their direct mother, and then nature was their direct mother. So they had a very sacred relationship with it, which is also to say that in North America there were close to 2000 cultural groups which each had their own lifestyle. And although there were sometimes some conflicts between these groups pertaining to the lands, but because there was a central belief that they all are people of the nature and come out of it, it was never so much as to cause any detriment to them, and they continue to celebrate the cultural diversity between each of these 2000 distinct cultural groups without forcing their views on any particular people. Now, when we talk about this particular spiritual aspect and of the nature that these people thought of, a book, The Spiritual Legacy of the American Indian by Joseph Epes Brown, also provide us a lot of the perspective, which is to say that he talks about the Amerindian people, which according to them nature was to be lived in harmony with, and there was a relationship of reciprocal appropriation between mother nature and the people, and nature was never meant to be isolated from the human beings. At all times it had to be talked about through a collective relationship between the nature and the people. And there was a spiritual dimension to it, according to which humans were a part and only one part of the greater nature at large, and any destruction or any devastation of nature would come back to haunt these people, and hence there was a lot of respect for nature. Now, when we talk about the Brown's book, The Sacred Pipe, he talks about the Siouan culture. The Siouan culture people strongly believed that the whole was one part, the whole of the creation was one interconnected part, and it had smaller parts, and all of these human beings were these small parts, but there was a large interconnection, which is also the reason why if there was an old woman, she was referred to as mother. If there was a much older woman, she was referred to as grandmother, according to the linguistics of the language of the Siouan culture. Now, the European colonizers' view was completely different from this particular view. They thought of nature as being soulless and thus completely thus being worthy of exploiting. and it was the burden of the European colonizers to exploit it as they deemed fit. Now, this particular view was further strengthened by Cartesian's dualistic approach, who distinguished between the subject or the mind and the object or the body, where the mind was considered the supreme and the body could be used to exploit the nature. There was a distinction between the rational human mind and the non-rational nature, and this view was used to basically reduce nature to a commodity which was rather to be respected, completely used for the whims and fancies of these colonial people. Now, Richard Drayton writes about these particular things in his in the Nature's Government, where he tells us that this commodification of nature was the driving force behind imperialism, colonialism, and all of these other things. And also later, it led to the birth of capitalism and universal development and materialism and all of these other particular things. Now, because of these Cartesians' dualistic approach, the colonizers felt that it was their missions to civilize the nature and the people who lived in the wilderness or lived in close connection with the nature. So rather than respecting the cultural diversity, they focused on homogenizing all of these people and destroying their native cultures. So we can see that the approach between the two could not have been a starker, as one thought of nature as a spiritual whole and protection of nature was their goal, other thought of nature as merely as a commodity and something to be exploited for their own whims and fancies. Which brings us to Raymond Murphy's governing of nature. Now, he talks about the fact that the colonizers believed in governing nature as per their own whims and fancies. He talks about four dimensions of rationality which became the central features of the colonial state. The first was the development of science using or exploiting or manipulating nature. The second was the expansion of the capitalistic economy. The third was an hierarchical organization, and the fourth was a formal legal system to manage social conflict. Now, to all of these four dimensions of rationality, the author Sai Deepak puts his own two more rationalities. First was the rejection of the native faith completely, which justified the conversion of Christianity of these native faith or the evangelization of these people and forceful conversions. And second was the replacement of the indigenous education systems or the production of knowledge and putting in place the own colonial education system to basically educate them and make them colonial citizens with their worldview as their benchmark. Now, the resource exploitation that was happening was so rampant that ultimately even the colonizers realized the fact that hey, there had to be some effort that has to happen for the conservation of nature. But even these efforts and these ideas took so long, and even when they used terms like sustainable development, they again focused on their own benchmarks and their own methods of conservation of nature rather than taking inspiration from these particular individuals who had lived in harmony with nature for so many years. They completely rejected the views of these traditional people, even though the traditional knowledge which had been there from eons and many centuries could tell them many things about how to live in harmony with nature and how to live in conservation with nature. Now, apart from this wreaking havoc on nature that was done by the colonial people, another thing that was destroyed was the knowledge systems of these particular native faiths. Now, because these native faiths prioritized oral transmission of knowledge, which was in turn their employing of storytelling to pass down knowledge from one generation to another, because of, let's say, many reasons, such as it could be only accessible to the people of the community, and the sanctity of the of the transmission could be maintained, sanctity of the source could be maintained. Now, because there was this oral transmission of the knowledge happening between the people, and the colonizers were of the view that unless it's written down, because they were people of the book following the gospel or the Bible, they felt that there was no authority or backing of anything that is being orally transmitted. They thought that this oral transmission of things was mystical and something which could not be believed, mythological and mythical, and so on and so forth. And because they believed these particular things, they did not actually give any legitimacy to their knowledge and completely ignored it, because there was no proof in writing. They felt that there has to be a proof in writing for any validity to be established. Now, the fact was that instead of faith being treated as a subjective path that can be used to connect with the divine, because their faith did not subscribe to the Christianity notions, where they were using their own notions to measure the indigenous faiths, they could completely destroy these faiths and delegitimize their claims, because they were measuring them on their own metric rather than understanding where these indigenous faiths were coming from. So through this justification, they categorically erased the history of these particular individuals by destroying their places or raiding their places and destroying their sacred spaces. And because close to 90% of the population were wiped out, we still do not know the extent of the loss that had happened on the native knowledge and their traditions and their systems and faith. But it was very easy, because there were oral transmission of these resources, for them to erase history by simply destroying these individuals and their sacred places, to make the oral transmission absolutely impossible, and then force their own beliefs and systems in place of their own original beliefs and faiths.